At 07:42 on May 27, 1940, the only sound in the lane outside the French village of Le Pinet was boots in the mist. 5 pairs, spaced with the neat, predatory distance of men who had done this before. Captain Jack Churchill crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, rain-darkened mortar scraping his sleeve, watching the German patrol materialize ghost-like out of the morning fog. His men, what was left of his company, lay scattered in ditches and behind hedges along the field, clutching Lee Enfields and Brenns, lungs still burning from the last forced march toward the coast. 33 years old, 14 years since Sandhurst. 2 campaigns abroad, none like this. 0 confirmed kills in combat. Behind the Germans, the war was collapsing in slow motion. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 36 days. Now their panzers were tearing through France at 40 miles a day. The British Expeditionary Force was running for the sea. In the last 72 hours, Churchill's company had lost 11 men in dribbles and chunks, machine gun bursts at crossroads, Stukas strikes on columns, a mortar that had walked into their last stand beside a barn. He'd seen the retreat turn into a rout, staff officers burning code books in roadside ditches, sergeants burying signal sets and mortars they couldn't haul, privates quietly pitching rifles into hedges just to run faster toward some rumored line at Dunkirk. But Jack Churchill was not running. He was kneeling behind that wall with a 6-foot English yew longbow laid across the stones, its 70-pound draw weight humming faintly in the damp air. Next to his boot, a small canvas quiver held a dozen cedar-shafted arrows tipped with broad hunting heads rather than target points. Modern war all around him, a medieval weapon in his hands. The Germans were 30 yards away now, close enough that he could see the lead man's breath, the way it misted Armagh, as he turned his head methodically. Hedge, farmhouse window, drainage ditch. A Feldwebel by the look of him. Veteran's gait. Probably Poland, maybe the Sudeten. A man who knew this business of advancing into broken country, nose full of cordite and wet earth. He was looking for rifles and machine guns and the blunt shapes of grenades. He was not looking for an English archer. Jack nocked an arrow, feeling the slight, comforting click as goose-feather fletchings met the string. His left hand found the bow's grip by memory. His right hand closed on the string and the nock in a Mediterranean draw. He'd done this 10,000 times in practice. On ranges in Surrey, on muddy fields in Norway, on manicured lawns in Oslo, at the 1939 World Archery Championships, where he'd finished 26th out of 63. Good enough to split a playing card at 50 yards. He had never done it with a man at the other end, moving, breathing, oblivious. He raised the bow. The yew-stave creaked under tension, a quiet, living sound that cut through the distant rumble of guns in his head. He drew to his ear, anchoring at the corner of his jaw, the way he always had. The Feldwebel took one more step, boots scraping on gravel, body just clearing the flank of an abandoned cart. His field-gray tunic was a perfect aim point. Jack's world narrowed to the tiny, dark notch of the arrowhead against that chest, the weight of the string under his fingers, the breath in his lungs. He let go. The arrow flew, a blurred line through the light mist. It hit with a sound more felt than heard, a dull, meaty thump. The German sergeant staggered once, eyes widening, then dropped without a cry, the shaft buried nearly to the fletchings just left of his breastbone. For half a second, no one moved. The other 4 Germans froze, catching only the end of the motion. A body falling, no muzzle flash, no crack. Then one shouted, high, disbelieving, and lunged toward the ditch, weapon swinging, eyes wide. Rifles cracked along the hedgerow. British .303 rounds tore into the confusion. 2 more Germans went down. The others dived for cover that wasn't there, flailing in the open lane. Churchill snatched another arrow from his quiver, aware, distantly, that his heart was hammering in some unfamiliar rhythm. Not fear exactly, he'd felt that before, coming under artillery in Burma and on black ice roads in India, but a sharp, rising clarity. Behind him, one of his corporals yelled, "Bloody hell, sir!" Half awe, half hysteria. Jack didn't answer. He was already drawing again. It would later be recorded, as best anyone could piece it together from war diary notes and half-remembered accounts, as the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last confirmed longbow kill of the Second World War. And it happened because one British officer had decided that modern warfare had not, in fact, made ancient weapons obsolete. This was one Feldwebel. In 3 days around Le Pinet, 7 German sergeants would die with arrow shafts in them. And on the other side of that wall, even as the first patrol disintegrated, more grey shapes were starting to move through the mist. The British Army never quite knew what to do with John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. He'd come out of the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926, with decent marks and a decent record, nothing especially brilliant, nothing damning. Commissioned into the Manchester Regiment, he went where most young infantry officers went in those years, the dusty, awkward edges of the Empire. Burma first. Jungle, rivers, malaria. He learned how to march in heat that boiled men's brains, how to share a foxhole with leeches and spiders, and how unreliable a Lee Enfield could feel when the monsoon turned everything into rust. India followed. Long, rattling train rides, barracks that smelled of curry and brasso, the endless ritual of peacetime soldiery, parades, inspections, clerking for majors who cared more about mess silver than marksmanship. Jack did his duties well enough. He also found other ways to keep himself interested. He rode motorcycles across Burma and India, chasing the edges of maps. Once, on a rural road outside Rangoon, he'd misjudged a bend at dusk and plowed straight into a water buffalo. He'd limped away with bruises and a bent bike. The buffalo had fared worse. In his spare time, he practiced the bagpipes until his Batman threatened mutiny, and he picked up the longbow almost as a curiosity. The instinctive discipline appealed, the blend of muscle memory, geometry, and calm. By the mid-1930s, peacetime soldiering bored him to the point of physical discomfort. The world was clearly moving towards something ugly. Germany had walked out of Versailles. Japan was chewing on China. Italy had taken Abyssinia. And yet regimental life in some cantonment could still revolve around polo matches and who was in which club. Jack resigned his commission in 1936. He went to Kenya and worked as a newspaper editor, then back to Britain, where he drifted into odd corners of pre-war show business. He appeared as an extra, a soldier naturally, or as an archer in films like The Thief of Baghdad. If the producers needed someone who could actually hit a target on camera with a longbow while piping a Scottish march between takes, he was their man. He was, in the parlance of a later generation, a character. When war came in September 1939, he didn't hesitate. He rejoined the army at once, returning to the Manchester Regiment. He did not rejoin as a normal officer. Into the new war, he carried 3 things that marked him out. A 6-foot English longbow, the same one he had used at the World Archery Championships in Oslo the previous year. A quiver of carefully selected arrows, some with field points, some with hunting broadheads. A Scottish basket-hilted broadsword, a claymore, hung from his Sam Browne belt, the steel polished as lovingly as any guardsman's boot. Any officer who goes into action without his sword, he would say, only half joking, is improperly dressed. To the staff officers in France, he was a curiosity. Peculiar, yes. Dangerous? That remained to be seen. The doctrine men didn't see a place for a longbow in 1940. The Germans had tanks that could outrun and outgun anything the BEF had brought across the Channel. They had Stukas that screamed down from the clouds with sirens fitted solely to shred morale. They had radios in every company, motor transport for every rifle section, and direct fuel injection in their fighter engines. What good could a length of carved yew and a medieval sword be against that? In the early months of the BEF deployment, Jack played the role assigned to him. Route marches, field exercises, digging in around small French villages that looked very sleepy and very far from the Ruhr. He kept his bow and sword with him, to the amusement and occasional disdain of brother officers. "Expecting Agincourt, are we, Jack?" one had quipped in a mess in Arras, clinking a glass of indifferent French wine. Going to stand in the mud and shoot at them until they run out of nights? Something like that, Jack had said mildly. Inside, he'd already done the mental calculus that very few of his peers had bothered with. Modern war cut two ways. It made some weapons obsolete. It also brought back old virtues: silence, independence from supply lines, the ability to kill a man without announcing yourself to every artillery battery within 10 miles. A rifle was a wonderful thing until you were out of ammunition, or until the flash and crack of your shot drew an 88's attention. A bow was slow, limited in range, and hopeless against armor. It was also absolutely silent. Its ammunition could, in a pinch, be carved from any decent shaft of wood. And if you put an arrow into a man's lung at 30 yards, it would kill him as surely in 1940 as it had at Cressy. He didn't know yet how often he'd get to prove that. He only knew that, as the panzers began to break through and orders came down to fall back, he was damned if he was going to leave his longbow in a baggage lorry. The BF's march to war had been orderly. Its retreat was anything but. In early May 1940, German armor burst through the Ardennes and punched its way to the Channel in a series of methodical, terrifying thrusts. The British and French, strung out along the Dial line, found themselves flanked, then nearly cut off. Company commanders like Churchill were told to hold, then to withdraw, then to hold again, often within the same day. Roads once neat with supply convoys became jammed with refugee carts, burning vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. On one bitter afternoon south of Arras, Churchill's company had tried to mount what the manuals would have called a textbook defense against a German probe. They'd sighted a Vickers machine gun at the corner of a sunken lane, interlocking fields of fire with Bren guns and farm outbuildings. Riflemen dug shallow slit trenches, their entrenching tools scraping cursed furrows into rocky soil. The first German infantry came in cautiously, feeling for resistance. Jack waited, watching through a barn loft window. When the leading section reached a hedge marked on his map, he gave the order. The Vickers opened first, the steady tat-tat-tat raking the lane. The Brens joined in, sharp as staccato. Rifles added their own, thinner notes. Germans fell. The survivors tumbled into ditches, returning fire. For a moment, it felt almost like the exercises back in England, attack met by prepared fire, the line holding. Then the Stukas came. They hadn't been anywhere in the initial contact plan. The manuals mentioned air threat. They did not convey the sickening feeling of hearing that banshee scream as the dive bombers came down, nor the way the ground seemed to jump when 200 VDP bombs plowed into it. The Vickers' muzzle flash, the Bren's distinctive chatter, the rifle's sharp cracks, all of it had painted a bright arrow in German eyes and "As shoot here." The lane junction ceased to exist in a roar of dirt, splinters, and burning cordite. When his company pulled back from that position, they left 3 men dead and 5 wounded. The Vickers lay twisted in a crater. The Bren barrels were warped, stocks shattered. They had done everything by the book. The book did not care that the enemy's book now included an integrated air and artillery response. Over the next days, this pattern repeated. A rearguard action along a roadside orchard ended with mortar rounds walking up the tree line, the Germans having triangulated the British firing positions from sound and flash. A farmhouse defense that seemed strong on the map collapsed when a German artillery observer saw muzzle flashes in the upper windows and walked 105mm shells onto the building. The lesson seeped in, ugly and slow. Every time you opened up with a conventional weapon, you started a clock. From first shot to incoming heavy response, you had perhaps 2 minutes, less if the Germans had their guns dialed in. Light mortars, machine guns, even Enfield volleys, they were all announcements. We are here. Aim at us. Jack, lying behind the stone wall at Le Pinet, with the longbow across his knees, had those lessons embedded in muscle and bone. His company was down to barely half strength. Ammunition was low. Mortar crews had been left behind when the lorries they'd been promised never arrived. He could order a volley as the German patrol advanced. They'd probably cut it down. They'd also give away their positions to every German ear within a mile. Then the German NCO would not just lie where he fell. His voice, his hand gestures, His section-leading ability would still be directing fire while he lived. Retreat doctrine called for controlled withdrawals, fighting delays, tidy lines. In reality, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and being chased toward a thin line of ships. It was in that gap between what Sandhurst had taught and what the French hedgerows were showing him that Jack Churchill's medieval idea finally stepped fully into the war. The bow had started as a talisman, a statement of attitude. When the shooting began in France, it became a tool. In the days before Le Pinet, Churchill had carried it slung with his rifle, an eccentric extra weight on already overloaded marches. Men snickered at first, then they saw him use it. The first time he'd loosed an arrow in anger was 2 nights earlier, in a copse of trees overlooking a road where German dispatch riders moved like ants along a line. His company had been ordered to avoid engagement, slipping north under cover of dark. But one motorcycle patrol had peeled off, slowly quartering the verge as if looking for stragglers. "Let them pass," his sergeant had whispered. "We haven't got the ammo to start it." Jack had watched, jaw clenched. 2 riders, one leading, scanning, one slightly back, less alert. A chance, if he could take it without lighting a flare of gunfire in the night. He'd slipped the bow off his back, knocked a broadhead, and drawn in the shadow of an oak. The arrow had flown low and flat across 30 yards of dark. The rear rider had jerked once, then slid sideways off his saddle, his machine clattering on into the ditch without a hand on the bars. The lead rider had shouted, throttled up in panic, then thought better of it, and fled into the dark. "Christ," the sergeant had breathed. "How'd you do that, sir?" "Practice," Jack had said. He'd walked down and yanked the shaft out of the dead man's back, wiped it on the German's gray tunic, and slid it back into his quiver. After that, the mocking in his own company dropped a notch. It turned into something like respect, if still tinged with disbelief. "Still mad, though," one corporal muttered. "Bows and arrows against panzers." "Not against panzers," Jack corrected. "Against the men who tell the panzer crews where to go." That distinction informed how he used his strange weapon. He didn't waste arrows on ordinary riflemen in long skirmish lines. A bow in 1940 was too slow-firing, too precious. He reserved it for the men who made a section function. The Feldwebel who walked point, reading ground and danger. The squad leaders who rallied men when a surprise burst of fire sent them to earth. The NCOs at crossroads, directing traffic, shouting orders during confusion. Kill a private, and the German army had hundreds more. Kill a sergeant, and the section wandered. He tuned his equipment accordingly. Some of his arrows still carried target points, useful for practice, or in a pinch for less critical work. Others he tipped with barbed hunting heads, ugly, wide blades that tore great, ragged channels through flesh, and did not come out clean. He shaved the shafts, waxed the strings, and practiced in odd, ragged moments, loosing at hay bales or chalk marks on barn walls while the company brewed tea or filled in ration forms. His company commander, a weary major who'd seen enough blood in the last 10 days to stop caring about the finer points of King's regulations, raised an eyebrow the first time he'd seen James indulging in target practice behind a farmhouse. "You're really taking that thing into action, Jack?" "I've already done so, sir," Churchill replied. "How many?" "2 so far." The major had stared at him, then exhaled smoke through his nose. "Fine," he'd said at last. "Just don't let the brigadier see it. He'll have kittens about image and dignity and such. As far as I'm concerned, if it kills Huns and doesn't jam, it's more used than half the kit they've issued us." There was risk, of course. The bow tied one of his hands, slowed his transition to rifle or pistol. If he misjudged a draw under fire, if the string snapped or a shaft warped, he could be left with a useless stick in his hands. He accepted the trade, because the bow also had 3 tactical advantages nothing else in his company could match. Silence. One arrow, well placed, raised no alarm until the target fell. Ammunition logistics. A quiver of arrows weighed less than the same lethality in 303 and could be retrieved and reused if they survived impact. Psychological shock. A dead man with a bullet in him was just dead. A dead man with a medieval arrow in his chest looked like a bad omen. At Le Pinet, with German patrols combing every side road between his position and Dunkirk, he put all three to work. He laid out his small arsenal behind that stone wall like a craftsman setting tools on a bench. Bow, quiver, his Enfield propped within reach, sword hilt gleaming faintly at his hip. He picked his targets not for convenience, but for their weight in the enemy's nervous system. The first Feldwebel went down in the lane that morning. 6 other German sergeants would follow over the next 3 days within a mile of that village, each with an arrow in them. It wasn't magic, it was direction. And in those same 3 days, Churchill's battered company would hold 2 roadblocks longer than higher headquarters had any right to expect, long enough for columns of exhausted British infantry, artillerymen, and signallers to slip past, heading for the beaches. On the German side of the line, no one wrote "killed by Longbow" in a report. The war diary of an infantry regiment near Le Pinet, for May 27th to 30th, 1940, reads much like any other. Patrol encountered enemy resistance in village. 1 NCO killed, 2 men wounded. Delay at crossroad due to loss of Feldwebel H to sniper fire. Repeated small arms engagements with withdrawing English units. The oddity at first was physical rather than conceptual. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, squad leader in a regiment that had swept through Belgium in a matter of days, saw it first. On the afternoon of the 27th, his section was ordered to probe a side road where an earlier patrol had gone quiet. They found the first body in a ditch. Feldwebel Kraus, chest dark with blood, lay twisted on his back, eyes open to the sky. Something protruded from under his torn tunic, a smoothly planed wooden shaft, pale against field-grey cloth. "What the hell is that?" one of the privates asked, voice brittle. Weber knelt, winced as he realized. An arrow. He'd seen them in old woodcuts, in his grandfather's stories of museum pieces and hunting in the Black Forest. Long shafts with feathered tails, iron heads that had once punched through mail and padded jacks. He had not expected to see one buried in the chest of a Feldwebel in 1940. He pulled the tunic back. The arrow was jammed deep, barbed head lodged in ribs or lung. Removing it would do nothing for the dead. He looked up at the hedgerows on either side of the road. They were gently stirring in a breeze, innocent and green. Somewhere in there, earlier that morning, someone with the muscles and skill of a medieval archer had drawn and loosed. "We have English snipers," one of his men muttered. "No," Weber said absently. "Snipers don't do this." They wrapped Kraus in a ground sheet and moved on. That night, over ersatz coffee, men talked. "An arrow, I see." "Where?" "Like Robin Hood, only with filthy boots," Weber's private insisted to another section. They laughed it off, then stopped when another patrol came in light. 1 Feldwebel. This time the man had been hit in a churchyard, collapsing behind a stone trough before he could shout. When they dragged him out, there was another shaft in him, this one coming in under the ribs. Rumors sprouted. Some said the English had special, silent rifles that fired wooden projectiles. Others muttered about French partisans, relics from old revolutions taking revenge. A few older hands, history buffs, or men with grandfathers who still told tales of the 100 Years' War, made the connection. "The English were archers once," one said, around a cigarette butt, staring into the dark. "Agincourt, Crécy. Men with long bows that could put a yard of ash clean through a horse. My grandfather said you could tell a longbowman by his fingers, thick as sausages from the pull." "And now?" "Now we have tanks," another snorted. "We have Stukas. What is one hedge croucher with a stick to that?" The answer came the next day, when a traffic jam built up around a crossroads north of Le Pinet. A single shrill of a whistle had halted the column. Standard drill for a possible ambush. Sergeants had moved up, yelling, sorting vehicles, pushing drivers into ditches to let panzers through. Then a man at the head of one platoon suddenly jerked and fell without warning, his cap rolling into the mud. An arrow shaft, long and thin, protruded from just under his right collarbone. Panic rippled. The men dived for what cover they could find, a ditch here, a doorway there. Vehicles slewed sideways. For 5 critical minutes, the flow of men and machines toward Dunkirk halted. By the time an 88 was dragged up and shells lobbed into the surrounding hedges, the Archer, if he'd still been there, was long gone. In the weeks that followed, a few German reports tagged this sector with a peculiar note: Feindlicher Scharfschütze mit Bogen vermutet. Enemy sniper with bow suspected. There was no doctrines to address that. Against machine gun nests, you called for mortars or 88s. Against tanks, you brought pack guns and air. Against a ghost in a hedge with a weapon centuries out of date, you did what men have always done. You moved more slowly, more nervously. You flinched at every rustle. You kept your head down just a little more. And the British units slipping past on nearby roads, hurrying toward the evacuation beaches, gained minutes they should not have had. The 3 days around Le Pinet blurred into each other in Jack Churchill's memory. Marching, shooting, sleeping in snatches, the constant itch between his shoulder blades that said aircraft might be circling above unseen. But certain images burned sharp. Day 1 was the lane and the first Feldwebel. Day 2 was the churchyard. German patrols had grown more cautious overnight. They came in groups of 8 or 10 now, not 5. NCOs kept their heads lower, peering under hedges as well as over them, fingers tense on triggers. Churchill's company had been ordered to delay at the village for as long as they could, then fall back toward a rail line that might still be in British hands. He placed his men in depth around the stone church that anchored the little hamlet. Riflemen in the graveyard, Bren teams in the priest's garden, one reluctant anti-tank rifle positioned to cover the road, though nobody believed it would do much to anything bigger than a staff car. He himself took up position in the bell tower, Bow and Enfield both within reach. From that vantage, he saw the German section fan out along the low wall of the cemetery. He picked the lead NCO again. Another Feldwebel, cap pulled down low, machine pistol at his hip. He moved with that same economical care. Hand signals, pauses, a sweep of the eyes. At 10 yards, he would have been inside grenade range. The temptation to drop a Mills bomb on them was real. But one explosion would bring more, and his men were dug into shallow, hasty scrapes, not bunkers. Jack drew and loosed. From the German point of view, it was as if their leader simply collapsed. The arrow struck under the man's ribs and angled up. His breath left him in a sudden, astonished grunt. He folded, machine pistol clattering on the stones. For half a heartbeat, the men behind him saw nothing but his fall. Then they saw the shaft. Shouts. Scrabble. One man fired wildly at the bell tower, rounds smashing stained-glass saints into powdered lead and jewel-bright shards. Jack dropped below the parapet, heart thumping, feeling stone dust shower his hair. "Now," he said into the throat mic of his field telephone, voice oddly calm. "Give them a taste." Bren guns opened from the flanks, 303 rounds chewing at the low wall, forcing heads down. Riflemen, drilled to pick out machine gunners and NCOs, added their own sharper reports. The Germans, leaderless in those first seconds, broke into reflexive chaos, some returning fire, some bolting for the road, others trying to drag their sergeant's body out of the shooting line. By the time a mortar team got its tube set up and lobbed a bomb toward the churchyard, Churchill's men had already begun to pull back by bounds, peeling away in 2s and 3s under covering fire. They held Le Pinet for 2 more such contacts that day. Each time, Jack used the bow once, then let conventional weapons do the rest, husbanding his arrows like gold. By his count, he'd put 3 sergeants down with shafts in those first 48 hours. Day 3 was the crossroads. The company fell back to a junction where a dirt lane met a slightly better road. A milestone, chipped and half illegible, stood at the corner. Beyond it, low fields spread toward a line of poplars, and somewhere beyond them, the rumored safety of a forming perimeter. They were nearly out, which meant the Germans were all the more determined to close the bag. By now, news of the English Archer had percolated through Jack's own ranks, too. "Sir, are you really planning to use that damn thing again?" his sergeant asked, as they dug shallow positions behind a hedge. "If I didn't, we'd have to coin a new term for missed opportunities," Jack answered dryly. He posted himself slightly forward of the main line, behind a wrecked farm cart near the milestone. From there, he had a clear view down the road where enemy infantry would likely appear. He had 6 arrows left. They came just after noon. 2 German sections, moving with bitter caution, leapfrogging from ditch to tree to broken wall. Behind them, further back, Jack could see shapes that looked like staff cars and motorcycle combinations, officers, and more NCOs. He waited, willing his men to hold their fire. At 40 yards, he saw the first Feldwebel, a compact, hard-looking man gesturing with a stick as he coordinated the advance. Jack drew. The bow felt heavier today, his shoulders ached, but the anchor point came true. The string brushed his ear, and the arrow flew. The sergeant went down, yell, confusion. Jack let that chaos build for 3 heartbeats, then shifted aim. Another NCO had popped up, shouting, trying to get men into the ditch. Second arrow. 2 sergeants in 10 seconds. His company opened up then, rifles, Brens, a boy's anti-tank rifle that cracked once at an unlucky truck further back. German return fire snapped overhead. Bark flew from the hedge. A bullet smacked into the cart Jack was crouched behind, sending splinters into his cheek. He didn't feel it. He was already reaching for a 3rd arrow. By the time that fight at the crossroads burned down, 4 German NCOs were dead with shafts in them. 3 others had been hit by conventional fire. The advance had stalled for nearly an hour, as officers reorganized and waited for heavier support. An hour in which hundreds of exhausted British infantrymen, straggling artillery crews, and even a fee, tankers, with their fuel-dry Matildas on tow ropes, shuffled past behind Le Pinet, moving closer to the ever-shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk. 7 sergeants in 3 days. 7 men whose absence in German lines created tiny, local vacuums. Patrols a little more hesitant, traffic jams a little more chaotic, firefights a little less coordinated. No official British historian ever drew a neat line from Jack Churchill's bow at Le Pinet to an extra company making it onto a beach at Dunkirk. War isn't that tidy. But for one small slice of the front, at a time when every minute of delay mattered, a single eccentric captain and his medieval weapon had made the enemy slower, warier, and less sharp than they otherwise would have been. When the order finally came to abandon the last holding positions and run for the sea in earnest, Jack slung his bow one more time, checked that his sword was still at his hip, and led what was left of his company down a sunken road toward the sound of distant ships' horns. He had 1 arrow left. He kept it. Jack Churchill made it off the beach. He reached England not as a casualty of a disastrous campaign, but as one of the many ragged, dirty, improbably alive men who stepped off boats and onto British soil in those chaotic days, as the Dunkirk evacuation pulled more than 300,000 soldiers out of the bag. For most, the retreat from France was something to be survived, then folded away into stories for pubs and grandchildren. For Churchill, it was a kind of warm-up. The man who had brought a longbow and a broadsword to a modern war did not get any less strange as the years rolled on. He joined the commandos. He went to Norway, pipes skirling as he led a raid into Veagso, sword at his side, grenades on his belt. He fought in Italy, charging with claymore drawn. He parachuted into Yugoslavia. Captured by Germans later in the war, he escaped from a camp armed with nothing but his nerve. His legend grew in fragments. The officer who stepped off landing craft playing the pipes. The madman who insisted on carrying a sword into machine gun fire. The archer who had killed a German with a longbow. The longbow itself disappeared into the fog. Some said it was damaged beyond repair later in the war. Others, that he hung it in a cottage and only took it down on rare, quiet evenings. Officially, no doctrine ever enshrined bring medieval weapons into modern combat. No manual appendix covered the tactical employment of longbows against motorized infantry. But unofficially, Among generations of soldiers and special operators who heard his story, Jack Churchill became a kind of patron saint of the field improviser. His bow at Pinet wasn't about nostalgia. It was about understanding that technology doesn't erase fundamentals. Shock, silence, precision, the knowledge of where to hurt an enemy so that his whole formation stumbles. A rifle, a drone, or a guided missile can all do that. So see, you'd a well-placed arrow in the right man at the right moment. The Germans who faced him never knew his name. They only knew that, in one sector of their advance, leaders died without sound, and that something about this enemy seemed old. Post-war, in calmer years, you could occasionally find an aging Jack Churchill on a hillside with a bow again, or with pipes under his arm, eyes away on some distance only he could see. Asked once about his exploits, he is said to have shrugged and replied, "I suppose I just didn't see why we should give up on something that still worked." In a London club, over a drink, a retired fellow officer would shake his head, smile, and say, "Mad Jack, he brought a bow to a gunfight and somehow made it make sense." And somewhere in a German attic, if it survived the bombings and the decades, there may yet lie an old tunic, folded away, with a neat, round hole in the front and a strange tear inside the lining where a barbed head punched through, mute testimony to a May morning when the 20th century met the 14th in a French lane. War does not often reward eccentricity. More often, it grinds the odd bits off men until they fit into formations. But sometimes, in desperate retreats and broken hedgerows, the army needs someone willing to drag an ancient idea out of history, string it, and see if it will fly. At Pinet, a 6-foot stick of yew and a handful of cedar shafts gave 7 German sergeants a closer acquaintance with the Middle Ages than they'd expected in 1940, and helped one battered British company and the men slipping past behind them buy a few more miles of road to the sea. In the end, that's what Jack Churchill's bow really was, not a throwback, but a reminder that any weapon that still kills the enemy and keeps your boys alive is not obsolete. No matter how many people mock it, right up until the moment the first arrow hits